Hi, it's Miles here at Fabricana. For those of you who've watched some of our videos before, you know that I'm a planner, I'm a measurer, I'm a pattern drafter. This is a really fun, quick project that basically starts with a square to make the main body of a mermaid tail, and then I'm going to show you how to draft a pattern to make the fun fin. You'll basically end up with essentially a mermaid sarong that's really fun for a last minute costume. Great if you want to downsize it for a child. So if you want to see the step-by-step process, please follow along. Let's get started. For our project, we've used this really fun shimmery, it looks like sequins, but it's actually a foil that's printed on top. It's a very stretchy fabric, which is nice because it makes it kind of adjustable to the body, and it also makes it drape really nicely. We also are using a fusible fleece. We're using black. Fleece also comes in white in case you're using a lighter color. So for all of the requirements and the quantities required, you'll find that information in the description. All right, we're gonna start making our pattern for the end of the tail. The pattern I'm drawing is for an adult size mermaid. If you're doing a children's size, you might want to make it a little bit smaller. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to take my piece of ledger paper, and along one of the long edges at the corner, I'm going to make a mark a ½ inch from the edge. I'm going to call that number 1. Then I'm going to make a mark along the long edge 1½ inches over, and I'm going to call that 2. We're going to show this all in the close-ups a little bit later. So marking down the short edge from 1, I'm going to mark 5 inches. And that's going to be mark number 3. And then along that same edge, I'm going to go from 1 down 9 inches. I'm going to call that mark 4. So across the top, I've got 1, 3, 4, and then number 2 here. So from 4 going out into the middle of my page, I'm going to draw a straight line at a 90-degree angle. And then I'm going to measure along that line that I just drew 10 inches and make a mark. And I'm going to call that 0.5. So it's probably not looking like much yet. But the next thing I'm going to do is connect 3 and 5 with a straight line, and then I'm going to connect 2 and 5. And this is really rough. At this point, I'm going to use these guides to create the shape of the tail, and it's going to take a bit of practice, but I'm just going to do a nice curve below the line that I drew between 2 and 5. And then I'm going to wing it out to the other side of that line and bring a nice curve down to 0.5. Then I'm going to draw a curve that's always below the line from 3 to 5. Just a nice gentle curve that kind of resembles the shape of a mermaid tail as we know them. So what we've just drawn is the actual stitching line for our tail. So what we need to do is add seam allowances to find the cutting line. So again, just using my ruler, and I'm going to use a ½ inch seam allowance because that's a nice easy measurement. I'm just going to gently move my ruler along my curve, kind of generally indicating a ½ inch all the way around. So this only takes a few seconds, and it really is worthwhile to have your accurate seam allowance. So once you have a dotted line, you're just going to connect it again smoothly with your hand along those dotted lines, and then you'll have your finished pattern once it's cut out. So just make sure you cut out your pattern on the cutting line a ½ inch away from your stitching line. So the first thing I want to cut in my fabric is actually my waistband, and I want to make sure at the end that I still have a piece left for my waistband. So I'm going to use this big ruler and my rotary cutter to do this quickly, but you can use a ruler and a chalk pencil to mark a 3-inch strip, and you can cut it with your scissors and you'll get the same effect. So we're just going to keep that 3-inch strip aside until we're ready for the waistband. So if you have a similar fabric to mine, that ours has a little foil on it, maybe yours has sequins, ours had a big selvage that didn't have any of the foil. So I've cut that off. I did it with a rotary cutter, but again, you can just do it with scissors. Make sure you get a nice straight, smooth line. So now that we've removed the selvages, we're ready to cut a square. And the square is going to be our basic shape to create the main part of the tail. So I'm going to take one of my corners and fold so I have a nice diagonal line. And I'm going to kind of smooth that out as much as I can. And I'm going to place pins as well. Hope you can see the whole shot here. It's quite a big piece of fabric. I'm going to grab some pins. And I'll start pinning at this point, keeping it nice and smooth, because of course it's a stretchy fabric. It's going to want to slide around a little bit. So we'll just add some pins to keep it under control. You really want to make sure that everything's smooth along that diagonal as well. So just kind of keep smoothing it out so everything's nice and flat. And once you've got it nice and flat, then we're going to pin along the other straight edge, just so that when we're cutting, nothing's going to slide around on us. So we've got our pins in, and we are ready to cut. So remembering that the edge of our fabric here was the nice straight selvage, we're going to use that as our guide to cut the nice straight line. So there we have it. We're going to save this piece for the end tail. We're going to remove our pins, and then I'll show you how to start stitching your tail. So we've removed our pins. We've got a beautiful shimmery square. This time we're going to fold it in half on the diagonal with our right sides facing. So the shimmery side to the shimmery side. And this time when we pin it, we want to be really accurate because we're actually going to be sewing on this edge. We only need to pin along one edge. Put in as many pins as you're comfortable with. Some people really like to sew with pins. It gives them a bit more control, especially if you're a beginner. Just make sure your fabric is nice and relaxed. So once you've got all your pins in place, we will meet you at the sewing machine. So we've set our machine to a zigzag stitch, so if the seam does get stretched, our stitches aren't going to pop. And then we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting kind of from that folded edge. We're just going to continue that zigzag all the way along that seam. Alright, so that was a bit of a workout at the sewing machine. We just sewed our nice 5-foot long zigzag stitch. And you're probably saying to yourself, Miles, this doesn't look much like a mermaid tail. So here is the magic of this technique. We started with a square. Now we're going to open up this big triangle. And that is going to start looking more like a mermaid tail, isn't it? So what we have is this big cone essentially. And we've got this extra triangle. So what we want to do is center where our seam is between these 2 points at the end. We're going to pin across that point and we're going to cut our triangle off. So I will start pinning and then we can cut. So we've made a lot of progress on the main part of our tail. I'm going to put this aside and we're going to start working on the end of the tail. Alright, so we've taken the balance of the fabric that we cut off earlier, and we've got our handy dandy pattern that we made. Now this line here is the fold line, so we've only obviously cut half of our tail. So in order to cut 2 pieces, we need, it's basically self-lined, doubled. So we're going to fold our fabric. We don't have to fold it totally in half. We can save a nice big piece for another project. We're going to fold just enough to get our 2 tail pieces, one here, and then we'll do another one here. So I'm going to lay my pattern carefully on the fold. And I'm gonna pin it in place so I can cut it out. So once we've cut out 2 pieces of the end of the tail in your main fabric, we're going to use this handy dandy stuff. It's called fusible fleece, and it is iron-on, so you don't have to do sewing to make it stick. You have to be careful with your iron and the temperature with whatever fabric you're using. So keep it at a low enough temperature you're not going to melt your fabric. And we're going to cut out 2 more tail pieces with this stuff. So I've just come from the iron. I've put my fusible fleece glue side down to the back of my fabric. I pressed from the fusible fleece side so I didn't risk damaging my fabric, and I was really careful with the temperature. And the reason that we've fused both sides of the tail is we want to maximize the amount of body and kind of puffiness that the tail has, because we're going to do a little bit of optional stitching on top, so that'll really show up with more fleece. So once you've done that, you're going to put your 2 tail pieces right sides together. We're going to pin around all the edges except for across that small part at the top, and then I will meet you at the sewing machine. Okay, we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance around our tail. I'm going to change back to a straight stitch. Since we've added the fusible fleece, our fabric no longer stretches, so there's no point in doing a stretch stitch. Again, kind of lining it up with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to start sewing with a back stitch and then continue around the tail. When I get to the end of the seam, I'm going to leave my needle in the down position. I'm actually going to pivot part of the way, not all of the way, and about halfway, and I'm going to do 1 stitch kind of on that angle. And then I'm going to pivot and continue my seam, and what happens is when I turn it, I can get a nice sharp point. So if we want our tail piece to look really nice when we turn it inside out, there's a lot that has to happen before we do that. We need to trim this center point as close as we can to our stitching line without cutting into it, and that'll give us a really nice sharp crease on the inside. We need to trim our corners really nicely, these ends, again fairly close to the point without cutting into it. And then we're actually going to clip these little curves, because those are a fairly tight curve. And if we want our seam allowances to lay flat, we've got to do that. These curves are okay because they're not quite so pronounced, but I am going to trim one of the layers of the seam allowances to grade the seam so that we don't have a big lump right near the edge. So I'm just cutting through 1 layer of fabric and one layer of fusible fleece, and I'm going to continue that for the rest of the piece, and then we will turn it inside out. Alright, so we've got all of our seam allowances trimmed, all of our points clipped. We now need to turn our tail inside out to reveal the nice blue shimmer. So once we've got that turned around, we are going to meet you back at the sewing machine for some optional quilting. So once we have our tail piece turned around, even if you don't want to do a lot of additional quilting, I'd at least recommend doing some edge stitching, and that'll help keep the tail a little bit flatter and keep it from the seams from rolling around. So I'm just going to do about a 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch edge stitch all the way around the tail. So here we have our finished tail piece. We've done the optional stitching, which is very fun. I did it freehand. If you wanted to use a chalk pencil to mark it, you might end up with something a little more symmetrical than mine, but either way, have fun with it. So once we have this ready, we're ready to attach it to the tail. So I've taken the nice long tail piece here that's getting attached to this narrow end. If you notice right now, this end just comes to a point, and the width of our tail here is 3 inches. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna cut a 3-inch across hole at the bottom of the tail. So I'm just gonna use my ruler. I'm gonna find where it measures 3 inches, kind of putting that seam centered and flat. And then I'm just going to cut that end off with my rotary cutter. The wrong angle here. So now we have a nice straight line that we can attach our tail with. So in order to have a nice clean finished seam at the end of the tail, we're going to put our end of tail piece between the 2 right side layers and slide it in to the hole that we just cut. We're going to line up the top edge of our tail with the edges of the hole. We're going to pin it in place, and then we're going to stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance across there, and then I'll show you how to turn the tail right sides out. So we've sewn across the top end of our tail. We're ready to turn it right sides out. I'm just going to reach in, pull the fin out. It's starting to look way more like a mermaid, I have to say. So now we're going to work at the top end of our tail. We're going to pin across the top of the tail. We're going to base that in place. Then we're going to take our waistband and we're going to cut the waistband to the same size as the top of our tail, leaving a 1/2 inch at each end, and that's going to become our seam allowance. And then we'll be able to attach the waistband to the top of the tail. So we'll show a little bit of the basting, and then we'll show putting the waistband on. So I've cut my waistband to the size of the top of my tail plus 1 inch. So that gives me a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either end of the tail. So I'm going to fold over a 1/2 inch. I've switched to a zigzag stitch to keep it nice and clean. And I'm just going to stitch that seam allowance down. This is going to make it a lot easier to run our ribbon through the top of our waistband. I'm going to repeat that on the other side, and then we'll be ready to baste the waistband closed. So once we've finished both ends of our waistband, we're going to fold our waistband in half along the length with the right sides out. And we're going to use a straight stitch again. This time about a centimeter seam allowance, which is about 3/8 of an inch. We're just going to continue basting all the way across this raw edge. So we've just finished basting our waistband. We're ready to apply that to the main part of the tail. I've put the long seam that runs the length of the tail is on the underside because we don't want that to show on the outside of our costume. Then I'm going to simply pin the waistband to the top of the tail. I'm going to mark it at both ends. I'm going to match up the center. Then I'm going to add a few more pins, and then we can go back to the sewing machine to do this final stitching. So I'm just going to lay it flat, find that center point where it's laying flat in the center. And I'm just going to apply a few more pins, and I'll meet you at the sewing machine. So we basted our waistband and our tail with 3/8 of an inch, which is 1 centimeter. So we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch, which is about 1.2 centimeters. So our basting won't show on the finished product. So we've stitched our waistband onto the top of our tail, so that leaves us a channel that we can run a ribbon through. So you can use a safety pin, or I'm just going to use a paper clip and hope for the best. And I'm going to run that through the top of the waistband. I hope most of us have done this before. The same technique as putting elastic into a pair of pants. So I'm just going to continue running this through, and then we can take a look at the finished product. So we finished running the ribbon through the top of the waistband. So the idea is now that where the center seam is, it goes on one side of your body, and then you're going to wrap this around your waist. And as we mentioned in the introduction, there is kind of a bit of a size constraint for this particular size based on the constraints of the size of the square that we cut in the first place. So what you can do is pull the ties around to the other side of your waist and cinch it in. You'll have a little bit of a slit on the side. We'll show it a little bit more on the mannequin. Also, as an option, you can put a little bit of fishing line or some thread that will hang around your wrist if you don't want your tail dragging on the ground. So thank you so much for joining us in making our kind of fast and fun mermaid tail. It'll be great for Halloween costumes or any other kind of costume party. Great for kids too who love playing dress up. You can just cut a smaller square and a smaller tail. So thank you so much for joining us. If you'd enjoyed this content, please follow us on Facebook and Instagram for much more content, and we'll see you soon.